I thought it would be a quick, ordinary grocery run with my nephew. Milk, bread, maybe a box of cereal, and then home. But somewhere between the produce aisle and the checkout line, a small moment cracked something open in me that I didn't even realize had been sealed for years. What he said wasn't dramatic, and what I did wasn't heroic. Yet that trip ended up changing the way I looked at my family, my age, and the quiet ways love can show up when you least expect it. Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now before I begin, tell me, where are you watching from? I'd love to know which cities and towns are joining me for this memory that stayed with me for years. It happened on an ordinary Saturday, the kind that starts with a list and ends with an overstuffed fridge. I was standing in my kitchen with my reading glasses perched on my head, holding a pen like it had some authority, trying to remember what I'd run out of besides patience. The house was quiet, too quiet for a weekend. My sister's voice wasn't floating through the hallway, the TV wasn't on in the living room, and even the refrigerator's hum felt louder than it should. I'd agreed to watch my nephew Mason while my sister handled a few appointments. He was in that in-between stage, old enough to think he didn't need anyone, young enough to still hover nearby when something was on his mind. I heard him before I saw him. The soft drag of socks on the floor, a cabinet opening and closing, then the pause that always meant he was deciding whether to speak. "Aunt Claire?" He called, careful, like he wasn't sure what kind of answer he'd get. "In here," I said, trying to sound breezy. He appeared in the doorway with his hoodie half zipped and his hair doing that effortless young person thing where it looked like he'd styled it on purpose. He glanced at the paper in my hand. "Are you going to the store?" "Eventually," I replied, "unless you have a better plan for dinner that doesn't involve cereal." He gave a small smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He wasn't asking about dinner. "I can go with you," he said quickly, then added, "if you want." That surprised me. Mason wasn't exactly the quality time in aisle 5 type. He usually stayed home, earbuds in, living in a world where grown-ups were background noise. "Sure," I said. "Company might keep me from buying things I don't need." He nodded, but his face stayed serious, like he'd already decided the store wasn't really the point. 15 minutes later, we were in my car, the late morning sun spilling over the dashboard. The neighborhood looked sleepy. Lawns freshly cut, mailboxes like little sentries, a dog barking somewhere far away. Mason sat in the passenger seat with his knees angled toward the door, staring out the window like there was something he might miss if he blinked. I glanced at him at a stop sign. "Everything okay?" He shrugged. "Yeah." That was the answer teenagers give when they mean not really, but I don't know how to say it without feeling foolish. I didn't press. I'd learned over the years that some conversations need space to find you. You can't chase them down like a runaway cart. The grocery store parking lot was busy, the kind of busy that made me glad I'd worn comfortable shoes. People pushed carts with determination, as if the right brand of tomatoes was a life-or-death decision. The automatic doors breathed cool air onto our faces as we stepped inside, and the scent hit me. Warm bakery bread, citrus from the fruit section, the faint sharpness of cleaning solution. Mason grabbed a cart before I could, his hands firm on the handle. "Look at you," I said. "Chivalry isn't dead." He rolled his eyes, but there was a hint of pride there. "Just tell me what we need." I read off my list, and we moved through the produce section first. The fruit was stacked in glossy pyramids, apples that looked polished, oranges bright enough to belong in a painting. Mason picked up an avocado, turned it in his hand like he was inspecting it for a hidden message. "You know how to tell if it's ripe?" I asked. He pressed it gently, then shrugged. "Not really." I stepped closer and showed him, my fingers lightly testing the skin. Soft, but not mushy. Like a handshake from someone who actually wants to be there. That got a quiet laugh out of him, the first one that sounded real. He placed the avocado in the cart, then reached for another and tried again. We went down the next aisle, and I caught myself noticing how tall he'd gotten. When had that happened? I still remembered him as a little boy who used to tug on my sleeve at family gatherings, asking me to come look at something he'd made out of blocks. Now his shoulders were broad under the hoodie, his voice deeper, his face caught between boy and man. As we walked, we passed an older couple arguing gently over which pasta to buy. The woman's hand rested on the man's arm, as if that small touch settled everything. I watched them for a second longer than I meant to, and something in my chest tightened. Mason noticed. He followed my gaze, then looked away. We reached the dairy section. The cool air there always felt like stepping into a different season. Mason's grip tightened on the cart handle as he stared at the rows of milk like they'd offended him. "You okay?" I asked again, softer this time. He swallowed, and his eyes flicked toward mine then away. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." He pushed the cart forward slowly, wheels squeaking in protest. "Do you ever feel like you're not sure where you fit anymore?" The question landed heavier than I expected. It wasn't about school or friends or anything simple. It was the kind of question that can turn a normal day into a turning point. I glanced around. People moved past us, busy with their own lists and lives. No one paid attention to the woman and her nephew standing by the yogurt like the world had stopped. I leaned against the cart, giving him my full attention. "Yes," I said honestly. "More times than I like to admit." He looked at me then really looked, as if checking whether I was just saying it to be nice. "When?" he asked. I took a breath. I could have answered with something light, something safe. But his expression was open in a way it rarely was, and I didn't want to waste that. "When you hit certain ages," I said, "people start treating you like you're supposed to have it all figured out, like you've reached some final version of yourself. But life doesn't work like that. Sometimes you're still changing, and it can feel lonely because everyone else thinks you're done." Mason's jaw tightened, like he was trying not to show relief. "That's how it feels. Like everyone expects me to be a certain way, and if I'm not, I'm failing." I nodded slowly. "That's a lot to carry." He stared down at the cart handle, his fingers tapping against it. "My dad says I need to toughen up, that it's just life." There it was, the real reason he'd come. I knew my sister's ex well enough to guess how he spoke to Mason, short, blunt, the kind of man who mistook silence for strength. I kept my voice calm. "Toughening up isn't the same as learning how to live with your feelings," I said. "Feelings don't make you weak. They make you human." Mason's eyes shimmered for a second, then he blinked hard, looking away toward the butter and eggs. "I don't want to be a problem," he said quietly. "Oh, honey," I murmured before I could stop myself. The word slipped out like it belonged there. He stiffened slightly, not because he didn't like it, but because he wasn't used to being spoken to with that kind of tenderness anymore. "You're not a problem," I continued. "You're a person. And you're growing. Growing hurts sometimes." He nodded once, the movement sharp, like he was trying to cut off whatever was rising in his throat. I reached into the cart and picked up a carton of eggs, just to give my hands something to do. "Can I tell you something I don't usually say out loud?" He glanced at me. "Okay." I set the eggs down carefully. "When I was around your age, I thought adults had some secret map. Like they knew exactly what to do when things got complicated. But as I got older, I realized most of us are just learning as we go. We make mistakes, we start over, we pretend we're fine when we're not." Mason's expression softened. "You." I let out a short, almost embarrassed laugh. "Especially me." That made him smile a little, and it felt like the fluorescent lights above us weren't quite as harsh. We moved on slowly, letting the conversation breathe between items on my list. Bread, chicken, coffee. He helped without being asked, choosing brands, reading labels, paying attention. It wasn't just helpful. It was like he wanted to prove he could be steady. At the end of the frozen foods aisle, we stopped near the freezers, the glass doors fogged slightly at the edges. Mason's reflection appeared faintly beside mine in the glass, two silhouettes, different generations, standing in the cold. "Aunt Claire," he said again, quieter. "Yeah." He hesitated, then spoke with careful honesty. "Do you ever feel like you missed something? Like you were supposed to have a life that looked different?" The question hit closer to home than he could have known. For a second, I saw my own life like a series of grocery aisles, choices made, choices not made, certain shelves I never reached for. I didn't want to burden him with my regrets, but I also didn't want to lie. "Yes," I said slowly. "Sometimes I do. And then I remind myself that a life isn't one decision. It's 1,000 small ones, and you can always choose something new, even later than people think you should." Mason nodded, eyes fixed on the freezer door, like he was listening to a lesson he'd needed for a long time. And standing there, in the middle of an ordinary store, I realized something too. He hadn't come with me because he wanted snacks or fresh fruit. He came because he trusted me enough to ask questions that felt dangerous to say out loud. That kind of trust isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It happens in simple places with simple errands. And it can turn a grocery trip into something meaningful before you even realize it's happening. By the time we reached the checkout, the cart was full and my list was crossed through in thick blue ink. The line was longer than I liked, but I didn't mind. Something about the slow pace felt right, like the world was giving us permission not to rush away from the moment we were in. Mason stood beside me, hands tucked into his hoodie sleeves, watching the conveyor belt as I placed items one by one. The cashier greeted us with a practiced smile, asking how our day was going. I answered politely, but my attention stayed on my nephew. He seemed calmer now, like letting those thoughts out had eased a pressure he'd been carrying. When we walked back to the car, the sun had shifted higher in the sky, bright enough to make us squint. The parking lot buzzed with engines starting and doors slamming. Mason loaded the bags into the trunk without being asked, his movements steady and deliberate. "You didn't have to do all that," I said. He shrugged. Didn't mind. On the drive home, the radio played softly, one of those old songs that still found its way onto modern stations. I caught Mason listening, his head tilted slightly. "My dad used to play that," he said. I glanced at him. Yeah. Before everything got weird. I didn't ask him to explain. I knew better than to rush someone into words they weren't ready to give. Instead, I said, "Some songs stick with us, even when the people don't." He nodded, thoughtful. Back at the house, we carried the groceries inside together. The kitchen filled with the familiar sounds of bags rustling, jars clinking against countertops. I started putting things away, and Mason followed my lead, sliding items into the fridge with care, like each one had a proper place. When the last bag was empty, we stood there awkwardly, the task finished, but the conversation not quite done. "Do you want some coffee?" I asked. "Or tea?" "Coffee's fine," he said, then hesitated. "If that's okay." "Of course it is." I brewed a fresh pot, the rich smell spreading through the kitchen. Mason sat at the table, elbows resting lightly on the surface, eyes following me as I moved around. It felt strange and familiar all at once, this quiet companionship, this unspoken understanding. I handed him a mug, watching the steam rise between us. He wrapped his hands around it, like he was warming more than just his fingers. "Aunt Claire," he said, looking up at me, "do you ever regret not saying something when you had the chance?" The question caught me off guard. I sat down across from him, cradling my own mug. Yes, I admitted, more than I like to think about. Like, what kind of things? I considered my answer carefully. The kind where you let fear decide for you. Where you stay quiet because you're worried about disappointing someone or being misunderstood. He stared into his coffee. That's what I'm scared of. Saying the wrong thing. Being the wrong version of myself. I leaned forward slightly. There's no perfect version of you. There's just the honest one. He looked at me then, eyes searching. What if being honest makes things harder? It might, I said gently. But pretending usually does too. The difference is, honesty gives you a chance to be understood. He let out a slow breath, shoulders relaxing just a bit. You make it sound simple. It isn't, I said with a small smile. But it's worth trying. We sat there in silence for a moment, sipping our coffee. Outside, a car passed by, tires humming against the road. The world kept moving, indifferent to the quiet shift happening in my kitchen. I'm glad you were here today, Mason said suddenly. Not just for the ride, for listening. My throat tightened, but I kept my voice steady. I'm always here. You don't have to earn that. He nodded, absorbing the words like they mattered, which they did. As the afternoon stretched on, I realized something else had changed too. I wasn't just guiding him through his questions. He was reminding me of my own capacity to care, to show up, to be needed in a way that wasn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes meaning doesn't arrive in grand moments. Sometimes it slips in quietly, between grocery bags and half-finished cups of coffee, asking you to pay attention. And that day, I was listening more closely than I had in years. The next few days stayed with me in a way I didn't expect. Life went on, of course. Bills needed paying, laundry piled up, mornings came too early. But something had shifted quietly beneath the surface, like a clock resetting itself without making a sound. Mason started stopping by more often after that grocery trip. Sometimes it was just for a glass of water or to sit on the porch for a few minutes before heading home. Other times he'd linger, helping me carry in mail or asking questions that seemed small but carried weight beneath them. One evening, the sky was turning that soft orange that always makes everything feel gentler. I was watering the plants on my porch when I saw him walking up the driveway, hands in his pockets, steps unhurried. "Hey," I said. "Hey," he replied, settling onto the chair across from me. He watched the water soak into the soil. "I've been thinking about what you said." I turned off the hose and sat down. "About honesty?" "Yeah, about not pretending." He paused, then added, "I tried talking to my dad." My heart tightened, but I kept my expression calm. "How did that go?" He shrugged. "Not great. Not terrible either. He didn't really get it. But I said it anyway." "That takes courage," I said. He gave a small smile. "Didn't feel like it. Felt like my legs were shaking the whole time." "Courage often does," I said softly. He looked out at the street, quiet for a moment. "I realized something," he said. "Even if he doesn't understand me yet, at least I didn't hide." I nodded, pride blooming quietly in my chest. "That matters more than you know." As the light faded, the air cooled just enough to make us pull our sleeves down. A neighbor waved from across the street, and Mason waved back automatically, like he was grounding himself in normalcy. "Can I ask you something else?" he said. "Always." "What made you stop saying things?" he asked. "Back then." I hadn't expected that. I thought about it carefully. "I think I got tired of explaining myself," I said, "of defending choices that didn't fit neatly into other people's ideas of success or happiness." He nodded slowly. "That sounds exhausting." It was, I admitted, but it also taught me that silence has a cost. He glanced at me. Do you think it's too late for you to say those things now? The question surprised me. I looked up at the darkening sky, then back at him. No, I said, realizing I meant it. I don't think it ever is. He smiled at that, a real one, unguarded, and in that moment, I felt something settle inside me too. A reminder that growth doesn't belong to one age. It doesn't retire when you do. When he stood to leave, he hesitated at the edge of the porch. Thanks, he said quietly, for being you. After he walked away, I stayed seated, listening to the night sounds gather around me. I understood then that what we shared wasn't about fixing anything. It was about recognizing each other. Two people at different points in life, both still learning. And somehow, that recognition felt like its own kind of beginning. A few weeks later, I found myself back in that same grocery store, standing in nearly the same spot by the produce section. The cart still squeaked, the lights still hummed, and the fruit was stacked just as carefully as before. But I wasn't the same woman who had walked in here with a list and a quiet ache she couldn't quite name. This time, I was alone. I picked up an avocado, pressed it gently, and smiled to myself. Small things have a way of becoming markers in our lives. You don't realize it at first, but later they carry meaning far beyond what they were meant for. When I got home, I unpacked the groceries slowly, deliberately. I brewed coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the same place Mason and I had talked weeks earlier. The chair across from me was empty, but it didn't feel lonely. It felt full of memory. That afternoon, my phone buzzed. A message from Mason. Just wanted to say, I used what we talked about again today. Didn't hide. I stared at the screen for a long moment, letting the words settle. Then I typed back. I'm proud of you, and I'm still learning too. The truth was, he'd given me something just as important as anything I'd offered him. He reminded me that being present matters. That listening can be a gift. That connection doesn't require grand gestures, just willingness. Later that evening, I called my sister. We talked about ordinary things at first, but then I found myself speaking more openly than I had in years. About how time passes faster than we expect. About how easy it is to assume everyone else is fine. She listened, really listened, and when we hung up, I felt lighter. As the days went on, I noticed myself changing in quiet ways. I spoke up when I would have stayed silent before. I reached out instead of waiting. I allowed myself to take up space without apology. All because of a simple grocery trip. I think about Mason often now, not with worry, but with confidence. He's finding his way, just like we all do. And I know that whatever paths he walks, he'll remember that he was heard when it mattered. Looking back, I understand something I didn't then. Meaning doesn't arrive wrapped in drama. It shows up in ordinary moments, asking if you're paying attention. That day, between shelves and small questions, I said yes. And it changed more than just an afternoon.